It's Che Guevara's birthday. You were my favorite friend of the 90s. I loved the 90s older brothers and my friends who had them. That's right. I would have loved to have a younger brother to do that stuff, so I had to wait till I had a little kid to do it. R.I.P. to Justin's dad. That's right. Okay, Rob, I think I already established the 50s, 60s aesthetic is mine, a la drive-thrus, etc. You can have 80s, 90s, so the ad reel is infringing. Okay, I apologize for that, Lodane. I've been dipping my toe into the 60s. We've been talking about the 60s so much with JFK and Vietnam and stuff that I feel like there's some connection there. But I hear you. I see you, I hear you, and I will take that under advisement. Happy birthday, Che, you legend. The man I told my coworker was such a Chad to his absolute dismay. I thought this was a Fortnite stream. Well, maybe eventually Ice Tray. I'm terrible at Fortnite. I'm really, really bad at it. Let's look at this. Here's Che on imperialism.
Bestialidad que no tiene una frontera determinada ni pertenece a un país determinado. Bestias fueron las hordas hitleristas, como bestias son los norteamericanos hoy, como bestias son los paracaidistas belgas, como bestias fueron los imperialistas franceses en Argelia.
Yeah, it's very staticky, isn't it? Maybe this one's better.
Lucha victoriosa trajo dos consecuencias. El despertar de los pueblos de América.
You can count on me. You're gonna have good old Rob to talk you through all this.
Viva Che.
Thanks for the 6 months of Tier 1 Panda Dome. Viva Che, that's right. Is this a little bit better?
No era indispensable el mantenerse constantemente recibiendo los golpes de los explotadores. Y cómo que el camino podía ser no tan largo como soñaran o como pensaran algunos dirigentes de los partidos que están llevando la lucha tesoneramente contra las oligarquías.
Listen, this is old footage, all right? The channel, the audio is not always great.
Y al mismo tiempo abrimos los ojos del imperialismo. El imperialismo empezó a prepararse también para ahogar en sangre las nuevas Cubas que pudieran existir. Y antes de morir, ya Kennedy había dicho que no admitiría nuevas Cubas en el continente. Y lo han reiterado sus sucesores, que además son lobos de la misma sucesora. En el ya Kennedy Cubas que pudieran existir. Para el imperialismo empezó a preparar el imperialismo para el
imperialism began to prepare itself as well to drown in blood the new Cubas that may exist.
Las nuevas Cubas que pudieran existir.
And before dying, Kennedy had said that he would not allow new Cubas on the continent. And his successors have repeated it. They're the same pack of wolves. That's one thing that I wanted to point out too, because we know that in the Kennedy assassination, how much Cuba figures into that and how much Fidel figures into that. And these anti-Cuban, anti-Castro groups that they wanted to frame for the assassination to invade, hopefully. And that's one thing, is that never really materialized. And I think it's interesting pointing out why that might be. After the Kennedy assassination, they never really did invade Cuba. And I guess what I think is that, like, number one, there's a ton of heat on them for the assassination, that there's so many people that are questioning the official narrative. Maybe it would have been like too much. they already escalated Vietnam to these drastic levels. Maybe they would have thought it would have been too much to then like go into Cuba and do the things that they were claiming Kennedy was preventing them from doing. But also you see their anti-communist strategy start to pay dividends elsewhere, in Brazil, in Indonesia. For example, this is covered in the Jakarta Method, and elsewhere in Latin America. And you almost get the idea that they just decided after the Kennedy assassination that they were just going to continue to isolate Cuba, use Cuba as an example of the things that they're trying to prevent, while then carrying out their anti-communist crusade throughout elsewhere in Latin America, just to ensure that there was no new Cubas that emerged out of this tradition. So I think that kind of makes sense in the context of like these intelligence community guys and the Kennedy assassination. They all wanted to invade Cuba. Knocked over a can there. And that's part of the reason they got rid of Kennedy in the first place, because he was preventing them from invading Cuba. But I think afterwards, they more took the strategy of just like, let's carry out this anti-communist ideology throughout Latin America and just ensure that there's going to be no more Cubas that emerge, and make sure we continue to isolate economically Cuba itself and make sure we continue to sanction it and just starve it out, and hopefully eventually it'll just collapse in and of itself, which just never happened. And they probably kept trying to kill Castro with little effect. And they still use gusanos for anti-communist work. I bet some were involved in Winston's killing last week. Oh, you think, is there a gusano connection? Weird, there's a gusano connection to certain prominent liberal or omni-liberal streamers as well, isn't there? And the long history of these anti-Castro Cubans have working with the intelligence community. That's a weird coincidence, isn't it? Yeah, Cuba is really cool. I was just reading how they saved the MPLA in Angola by sending troops to fight the CIA-backed UNITA. Yeah, and they've been on the side of colonized countries in their struggle for independence, like time and time again. The CIA tries to assassinate Rob with an exploding rain energy drink like the Castro and the cigar. That's the thing. I don't think I'm on there. I don't doubt that there's probably a file on me with some of these people, but I don't think I'm on the radar enough where they need to get to that level. Maybe eventually. Also found out in Devil's Chessboard that the guy that James Bond is based on is a damn Canadian working for MI6 in America, doing anti-Nazi spy work and even calling for assassination of Nazi lobbyists and pro-Nazi businessmen. And that is interesting. Because all these early CIA guys loved James Bond. They were all obsessed with the James Bond novels. I wonder if you're in the anti-tanky doc. What is the anti-tanky? What is that? Let's continue this. Looking at this Che speech, though.
Que además son lobos de la misma camada, así que no habría por qué pensar que fueran a tener una filosofía diferente. Pero además de reiterarlo, han demostrado sus intenciones de llevar a cabo esta acción. Llevarla a cabo no solamente en América, sino en todos los países del mundo en que se creara la lucha, se desarrollara la lucha revolucionaria. Ellos trataron de masacrar a Argelia, pero Argelia fue libre. Tratan hoy de liquidar al pueblo de Vietnam, pero el pueblo de Vietnam es más fuerte que ellos. Y el pueblo de Vietnam sigue día a día anotándose.
Let's get some Uncle Hose in the chat.
Y haciéndole cobrándole también en sangre de sus soldados la inmensa cantidad de víctimas que el imperialismo hace en el pueblo de Vietnam del Sur. Y la lucha sigue, seguirá hacia la victoria. Empezó incluso antes que la nuestra en el norte. Se consolidó antes que nuestra revolución pudiera siquiera llegar triunfante a La Habana.
Red Jam, we got a bunch of new emotes. I still have like 10 more slots, so we're gonna have way more. But we got we got JFK, we got Mr. X, and we have Uncle Ho. Now. This channel simply has the best emotes. I agree. Yeah, I agree. There we go.
Pero todavía debe seguir luchando. Y Laos está en las mismas condiciones. Y en África hay varios pueblos que han tomado ese camino.
Can we get the face of the girl looking at the camera when Ryan Grimm was telling her about Russia? That would be a good one. Like,
y la Guinea Portuguesa está triunfando en sus luchas. Pero hoy...
Do you have a China emote in mind? I guess a Deng Xiaoping emote would be pretty cool. Or a President Xi emote. That would really piss off the libs. I'd like to make one or... You can... Sure, Lodin, you can make a couple of emotes. Absolutely, of course. A Deng Xiaoping emote could be good. I think... Well, I mean, Mao. I also wanted a Kim Il-sung. The two Michaels. The two Michaels emote. We gotta save those two Michaels, folks. We gotta save those two Michaels. Yeah, I would like a Kim Il-sung, because the triad of post-war revolutionary heroes. You could have Mao, Uncle Ho, and Kim Il-sung. So I don't know. We'd have to choose between Mao or Deng Xiaoping. I think a Deng Xiaoping emote would actually make a lot of sense considering what we talk about a lot on the street. We'll see. We'll table this discussion. A young Stalin emote maybe would be good too.
El recuerdo del Congo y del mundo. Ahora, en ese Congo tan lejano de nosotros y sin embargo tan presente, hay una historia que nosotros debemos conocer y una...
Cinnamon Challenge, is it the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party? I didn't even know that. If that's true, we should absolutely do that. On July 1st, I did not even realize that. Oh my gosh.
Los paracaidistas belgas tomaron por asalto la ciudad de Stanleyville, masacraron una cantidad grande de ciudadanos y como acto último, después de haberlos ultimado bajo la estatua del prócer Lumumba, volaron la estatua del expresidente del Congo. Eso nos indica a nosotros dos cosas. Primero, la bestialidad imperialista. Bestialidad que no tiene una frontera determinada ni pertenece a un país determinado. Bestias fueron las hordas hitleristas, como bestias son los norteamericanos hoy, como bestias son los paracaidistas belgas, como bestias fueron los imperialistas franceses en Argelia. Porque es la naturaleza del imperialismo.
Imperialism in its very essence is what transforms men into beasts. And also Che correctly linking the horrible violence of the Nazis with the horrible violence of the US. Something I too have been spending a lot of time doing lately, much to the chagrin of some of our friends in the Social Democrat Twitch streaming community. They've not been happy about this. But this comes from a long-standing tradition that I happen to subscribe to.
La que la convierte en fieras sedientas de sangre que están dispuestas a degollar, a asesinar, a destruir hasta la última imagen de un revolucionario, de un partidario de un régimen que haya caído bajo su bota o que luche por su libertad. Y la estatua que recuerda a Lumumba, hoy destruida pero mañana reconstruida, nos recuerda también en la historia trágica de ese mártir de la revolución del mundo, que no se puede confiar en el imperialismo, pero ni tantito así, nada.
This is the lesson we need to learn. This is the lesson we need to learn. Not enough people understand this. It's been decades, and I think not enough people understand this very basic concept about anti-imperialism. Okay? Not enough people understand this. You cannot trust imperialism for a minute, not even a little.
No se mágica de ese mártir de la revolución del mundo, que no se puede confiar en el imperialismo, pero ni tantito así, nada.
You can't give them an inch. This is what people don't get. This is what our friends in the Social Democrat and liberal or omni-liberal world of online Twitch streamers don't seem to understand. You can't trust them at all. That means zero. The imperialists. When the imperialists are saying something about another country, they're lying. These people are liars and murderers. Never forget that. Once you understand that, I think it clarifies a whole lot of stuff about foreign policy and about what our positions should be, even on these tricky subjects. Even on these tricky subjects, foreign policy, controversial stuff. When you just understand this basic framework of who the imperialists are, who they represent, and you just understand that you need to be in opposition to them each and every time, it makes this stuff, it gets, these issues get overcomplicated. They get, it becomes difficult to take a stance. It becomes controversial. But if you understand this basic framework, you're on the right side each and every time. When you see what the imperialists are saying, and you just know intrinsically that they're lying for their own benefit. So many people still don't understand this. It's actually quite discouraging how many people don't understand this still.
Bajo la bandera de las Naciones Unidas en el Congo fue asesinado Lumumba. Y esas eran las Naciones Unidas que pretendían los norteamericanos que vinieran a inspeccionar nuestro territorio. Esas mismas Naciones Unidas. Y la satisfacción siempre creciente de que el nombre de Cuba recorre los campos de América y recorre también los campos de otros países del mundo que luchan por su libertad, significando siempre lo mismo. La imagen de lo que se puede conseguir mediante la lucha revolucionaria, la esperanza de un mundo mejor, la imagen por la cual vale la pena arriesgar la vida, sacrificarse hasta la muerte en los campos de batalla de todos los continentes del mundo. Nuestra lucha como bestia, la que la convierte destruida hasta la última. Nada. Ni tantito así.
Yeah, you know, keeping an eye on Peru, I think, is important right now, because they're right now in Peru. They're running the exact playbook. All the '60s the '60s Red Scare shit in Latin America is back once again. Now they're like, we're not going to concede the election. We're not going to concede the election because we're like, this is the battleground against communism. That's what they're saying in Peru. And we know as well that the Canadian government is overwhelming on the sides of the neoliberals and the fascists in Latin America, whether it's in Venezuela, whether it's in Bolivia, or whether it's in Peru. Canada is a big part of the Lima Group. The Lima Group is like the group of nations that exists just to ensure that they destroy socialism or any semblance of socialism in any of these Latin America countries. Well, now they're losing Peru. And they're on the verge of losing other countries that are part of this coalition as well. So we have to make, like, there's for sure going to be an effort to overturn the results of this election in Peru. And we can talk about Castillo. We talked about Castillo's, like, regressive social views. But, like, we can't let that kind of stuff overshadow the fact that this is a movement by indigenous people and trade unionists and leftists to overthrow this kind of neoliberal hegemony. And so they need our critical support. And is Bolsonaro's done, Duque is struggling, and Duque is in, that's Colombia, right? And like losing Colombia would be, am I correct about that? Let me just check, just to make sure I have my, because I'm not a fucking expert on Latin American governments. Yeah, okay, I just wanted to be clear. Colombia has been like Colombia and Brazil really has been like the home base of the neoliberals in Latin America as they carried out this like genocidal, violent, anti-communist crusade throughout the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s. Operation Condor, which we've explored. A horrific program of rendition and illegal detainment and torture and murder of trade unionists and political dissidents and leftists in this part of the world. It's crazy how Duque is absolutely soaked in blood, yet he's not considered the evil dictator of South America. Well, yeah, it is crazy, biggerwig, but it's not crazy when you understand the basic idea, and I know you understand this, so I'm not like correcting you. I know you get this, but the reason that this is allowed to happen is because you're allowed to be soaked in blood if this happens in pursuit of anti-communism at any cost. Then it doesn't matter. You can murder and kill and torture all you want, and you'll never be held up to this standard as being like a brutal dictator because you're doing it in service of capital. And the people that go against that, the people that push back against that, people like Castro or Che Guevara, or Chavez or Allende in Chile, they get framed as being the dictators and the brutal, usurpers and all this shit. Yeah, it's as simple as that, Ben. They don't recognize the humanity of leftists. And you see as well, you look at the Jakarta Method and this book and like the extent to which they push this kind of fanatical anti-communism to the point that like the Brazilian military basically was so anti-communist that they talked about communists like a vermin or like a disease or a cancer that has to be eradicated and destroyed. Like the United States government only wanted to encourage other governments in the developing world if that's the view they had about leftists and communists. If they viewed them as subhuman, which allowed them then to just carry on this like campaign of brutal violence and torture and repression. But I think this is this Che quote is really good because it really like gets to the heart of it, what it is to be an anti-imperialist. And I think being an anti-imperialist has been a central part of my sort of journey to the left, like getting involved in the anti-war movement, learning about the history of the United States imperialism and what that's looked like, learning about the history of colonialism and neocolonialism and this kind of ongoing process of exploitation. This is like one of my, I think, my central values when it comes to my political values is being anti-imperialist. And this is this basic idea that Che's outlining here, where you can't trust the imperialists, not for a minute, not even a little, nada. This is what trips people up a lot. And you have a lot of people that claim to be against imperialism, they claim to be against war, they claim to be against regime change, but over and over again, they end up, if not siding with the intelligence community and with the fascists and with the regime changers, they'll at least be like, well, I'm against them, but I'm also against X government or Y government, or X brutal dictator or Y brutal dictator. And this to me is just a nonsense stance. Like it's cowardly, in my opinion. It's cowardly to like try to maintain this idea of like, oh, I'm against the wars, I'm against the regime, I'm against regime change, but then time and time again, repeating imperialist propaganda about certain countries, or backing up certain narratives that imperialists are using to carry out this kind of regime change. And it is lazy too. We can walk and chew gum. Two things can be bad. That's the mantra of the social democrat, non-anti-imperialist. Two things can be bad. Great. Thank you for this brave stance. I'm getting chills by the absolute bravery that it takes to come to this conclusion. Great job. Thank you to our friends in the Soap Dem community. And listen, it gets tricky sometimes. We're in the early stages. I've talked about it many, many times. We're in the early stages of a new Cold War. We're in the early stages of a kind of a new Red Scare. And if you think it's hard now to maintain certain stances about China or North Korea or Venezuela or Iran, it's going to start getting a lot more difficult as we progress into this, as we see like the U.S. empire continue to like thrash and it's like death throes. It's going to become more and more difficult to do this. But this is why I think it's important to view anti-imperialism as in this way, as kind of a non-negotiable stance. And you have to hold on to that, I think, regardless of how difficult that's going to get. As we progress into this like new era of the Red Scare, the new Cold War. I went to a normie political event yesterday. I swear someone was trying to China pill. Was like just shocked at what I was saying. He said something about being afraid of a war with China. I said, worst case, we lose to China and get public transit and affordable housing. Yeah, I'm sure that went over really well. Once again, if you're worried about war with China too, maybe you should take a look at who's trying to start that war and who's trying to avoid the war. If you actually look at this, you'll see that there's a very clear narrative that takes shape. You've just become an elite member of the Friendship Triangle. Comrade Social Distancing, thanks so much for gifting 5 subs. Thank you very, very much. People do spit up their first China pill. Well, yeah, and that's because there's been a very, very concerted media, full court press to ensure that everyone is like as afraid as possible as this country, or at the very least, people on the left that are like, yeah, I'm against America, but China is just as bad because it does all these other bad things. They're imperialist too, so they're bad also. There has been a very, very concerted effort to ensure that like that's as far as you can go left. The farthest you're allowed to be left is to be like, yeah, I'm on the left, I'm against American imperialism, but I'm also against Chinese imperialism in the form of the Belt and Road. Or they're doing settler colonialism. We hear that a lot too, right? In like Tibet or Xinjiang, China's settler colonialists, just like us. And that's the thing. It's like it's important that everyone like understands like who the imperialists are. It's not just this nebulous concept that can apply to everyone. We're talking about a specific group of people. And it's not just the Americans, but the Americans are at the head of this snake currently. But it's a global power structure that's been going on for centuries. In the 80s, people did this with Japan because of the deindustrialization of lots of big auto manufacturing cities. Yeah, we've talked about that kind of Japan scare in the 80s, Moist Owlets, and how that worked out. And that's actually something I was thinking about it because, again, we know about Operation Paperclip and the way that the United States led the effort to put Nazis back in charge of West Germany. What we don't talk about a lot is that they also went through a similar effort to ensure that the Japanese ruling class also stood in place and to put former Japanese fascists back in positions of power in Japan as well. And I almost think that like there's kind of this effort to kind of try to turn Japan into America too after World War II, and they almost kind of like embraced this idea of Japan becoming this global economic power because they're still allied. Ultimately, they're still allied with the same sort of powers. And then something tricky happened where China kind of snuck in there and usurped Japan in that role. And then now you have capitalists and imperialists in the West being like, no, not like this. This is not how it was supposed to happen. And that's why they're freaking out about China now, because their plan went way off the rails. Because their plan was to control China through their association with the Western capitalism, but really the opposite happened. I've only recently come around on China, but I found that it's really difficult to get reliable information about it. Well, that's why, and that's why I just don't trust what we hear in Western media about this. Anything. Whether we talked about Hong Kong a little while ago, like when those Hong Kong protests kick off, and it was all of a sudden in the news every single day, that immediately just has, if you've got your anti-imperialist radar on, you start seeing the mainstream media, which is like the media arm of these imperialist powers, even though it kind of pretends to be independent. When you see them start talking nonstop about these kind of protest movements and the pro-democracy protesters versus the anti-democracy protesters, and kind of trying to split Hong Kong from China and kind of trying to delegitimize that. I mean, it was clear to me what was going on, right? So you can tell they're trying to craft this narrative. And that's why, even if I might agree that everything about China isn't perfect, or that they do some bad stuff, or they commit human rights violations, I also just don't trust the details of this when it comes out through Western media, because Western media is like, by and large, 100% devoted to imperialism and ensuring that imperialism carries on. Look, you silly tanky. China forgives those loans they give out because they want friendly trade deals. They're the same as when we forced countries to sell their public schools. It's exactly the same. It is exactly the same. For sure. When China goes and builds roads and bridges and hospitals and ports in Africa, that is like the exact same as like assassinating political leaders there, anti-colonial political leaders, and installing fascist military dictatorships that allow U.S. Companies to employ child labor in like mines to like mine diamonds and lithium and other natural resources, and then building no roads or hospitals or anything like that. It's the same. It's the exact same thing. We're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, though, because what I wanted to talk about was Syria. because Syria has been kind of a third rail in leftist politics for a while now. It's extremely controversial, and it's the kind of thing that I've deliberately avoided ever talking about because of the ways that it's become so highly charged and so fucking controversial. Yeah, I'm gonna get bapped. But here's my general position on this. Taking this Che quote as a baseline, you can't trust the imperialists for a minute, not even a little. We know beyond a shadow of a doubt, and it should not be controversial to say this. We know beyond a shadow of a doubt that the United States-led intelligence community has been trying to do regime change in Syria for like a decade now. You know, in the after 9/11, when David Frum, liberal hero David Frum, came up with the axis of evil, it was Iraq, Iran, and Syria. That's the axis of evil, according to David Frum. The imperialists and the intelligence community, their friends in the intelligence community, have had their sights set on Syria. It's an essential part of their regime change strategy. Like the like delusional neocon idea in the early 2000s after 9/11 was to overthrow Iraq, and then they were going to go right onto Iran. They were going to go right onto to Syria and just create this, like, in all these states, create these like these new like sort of neoliberal bastions in the Middle East. That was like a centerpiece of the neocon strategy. We know for sure that the imperialists and the national security establishment, the intelligence community, have had their eye on Syria for a while, and have been intricately involved in trying to do regime change there over the last decade. And like the Syrian civil war has been a fucking disaster for people in the region. And the Syrian civil war, again, it's not even controversial to say this. The intelligence community and the national security establishment has been arming and funding the opposition parties and the disparate groups that make up the sort of free Syrian movement, the anti-Assad Syrian movement. They've been funding and arming this civil war and intentionally stoking it and intentionally making it worse. Like, we know this. This is not like, it's not even a secret, right? We know this. And it gets really tricky because, like, you know, this war has been a fucking disaster for Syrian people, and war crimes have been committed in this war. And I don't think it's controversial to say that, like, Assad has committed war crimes in this civil war. I guess my thing though is if this is a civil war that's happening with our encouragement, and when I say our, I'm talking like the Western powers, America and their junior partners like Canada and France and the United Kingdom. This is a civil war that we have deliberately encouraged. We have deliberately made this worse. So we share a lot of responsibility for the violence that has happened in this civil war. And the idea that because there's been acts of violence in this war, and there's that fact that war crimes have been committed in the course of this civil war, that we can't say, like, I'm against regime change here. I'm against the regime change in Syria without being labeled as an Assadist from not just liberals, but like leftists. There's a whole left movement out there that's like, oh yeah, we're on the left, and they care a lot about Syria and the Free Syria movement and making sure that there's no Assadists in their midst. And you wonder if the intelligence community maybe has their fingers in that. Bellingcat is an example of that, right? Bellingcat got their start talking about Syria and the civil war, and talking about Assad and get their funding. They get funding from the intelligence community. Again, that's not a conspiracy. Like, we know this. You're not allowed to defend Gaddafi or Assad without being called a terrorist. And again, like, this is like in the Iraq War, before the Iraq War, that was the line, right? Anyone that was against Iraq War, oh, you love Saddam. And no, being opposed to the Iraq War, regime change in Iraq, did not mean that you liked Saddam. Saddam was a terrible person. Saddam was himself one of these CIA anti-communist dictators and committed brutal atrocities against, like, religious minorities, but also against leftists and communism. Like, in Iraq had, like, one of the biggest, most well-organized communist parties in the Middle East. The CIA intentionally empowered Saddam so they could destroy that. Saddam was not a good guy. But does that mean that regime change in Iraq was good or was a good idea? Of course not. It was a fucking terrible idea. And pointing that out didn't mean that you supported Saddam. Just as pointing out that, like, I don't think what these intelligence community guys want to do in Syria, which is regime change, they want to do exactly in Syria what they did in Libya. And if you see what happened in Libya, you should say it should not be difficult for anyone to say we should not be doing that. We should not be doing that in Syria or anywhere else. Because we're not doing it to help people. We're not doing it to punish people for war crimes. We're not doing it to help the Kurds or religious minorities that we think are being oppressed in this situation. We're doing it at the behest of the imperialist powers, and we're doing it for their benefit. And that's the reason that they're pushing for this. I never got into Bellingcat because people said they were sus, been waiting to hear different. Well, this is the thing about some of these outlets as well, because I think Bellingcat does some good research and journalism about domestic right-wing extremism. And that's where I think that it gets kind of tricky. I've been told despite all that, Bellingcat was good because they're reporting on right-wingers in the US, and that's the whole game. That's the whole game, Sam. They do actually good reporting on domestic extremism and right-wing extremism in the United States. That gives them a kind of credibility on the left. And then they go and talk about foreign policy, and they're like, "Hey, you shouldn't be an Assadist." Who benefits? Who benefits from that? That's the fucking game, you know? Putting a kernel of truth in your propaganda. That's exactly right. And again, they get credibility. That's why I do trust a number of these outlets to talk about domestic extremism. But any of these outlets that have even one close connection, to the intelligence community or to, like, the NED or any of these, like, CIA cutouts, if there's a connection, then when it comes to foreign policy, I don't trust it. I don't trust it a little bit. I don't go, maybe. I don't even trust it for a minute. Not even a little. Yeah, it's like the Democrats. They're marginally better on the Republicans on domestic policy, but foreign policy, yeah, there's a consensus. And there's subtle differences within that consensus. Like, I wouldn't say U.S. foreign policy is completely bipartisan, because you see how certain presidents can kind of shape it. They can kind of shape it in certain directions, but they can't say, like, no, we're not doing regime change here. Pull everyone out. They can't. And that's, I think, why I have a certain level of sympathy with Obama. I don't have a ton of sympathy because, like, you know, he's a war criminal. But you understand that if you get elected president, there is a deep state. There's a state within the state, the national security establishment, that are working to implement their vision of foreign policy. And if you go against that, they're going to work to undermine you. And I think Obama was kind of up against that to a certain level. He gave them what they want in Libya, and look what happened. And he really did try to hold them off, I think, a little bit in Syria. Which is why, frankly, and I haven't even done a lot of research into the whole, like, the OCPW thing. the gas attack. I don't want to get too much into this conspiracy theory. One thing that I will always notice, though, is this kind of coincidence where Barack Obama says, like, well, I'm putting this red line. There's this red line where if they use chemical weapons, then we'll have no choice but to go in there. And what happens right away? It seems like there's kind of a coincidence there where it's like, oh, look, there it is. Assad, he did it. He did the chemical attack. So now we have to go do regime change there because you said that was the red line. No, I know he couped Honduras. I would never defend Obama's foreign policy. It was a disaster. It was a complete disaster. I hate Obama for being a catch and kill operation for revolutionary energy post Bolin crash, 2008 crash. Oh yeah. And in many ways I think Obama was an op. In many ways, I think Obama was an op. I know he has connections to the anti-communist movement in Indonesia. His stepfather was like one of these anti-communist lunatics in Indonesia. There's a strong possibility that Obama's mom was connected to the intelligence community. Oh yeah. I think Biden was super involved in Honduras and Central America and Hillary as well. Hillary was the leader of the State Department. Nelson Mandela, op or nope? Well, no, because Mandela was a revolutionary. But I do think in order for him to be perceived as like a global leader, his legacy had to be kind of whitewashed. And also, he had to be held in check by these neoliberal institutions like the IMF, who prevented him from carrying out any of the land reforms that he wanted to do. Like, if Mandela had not played ball, like if Mandela had just said, fuck you, IMF, I'm not paying back the loans that the apartheid government took out, I'm going to do these land reforms and stuff and do all the radical policies that he wanted to do, they would not have accepted him into the sort of global cadre of leaders and kind of allowed him to maintain this position. Yeah, his closest allies were Castro and Arafat. Yeah, like he was quite a revolutionary figure, but I think he was held in check by these institutions like the IMF. It whitewashes all our radical leaders. It kills the one that can't. Sometimes it does both. You know who wrote about this too is Lenin. Lenin wrote about this. Lenin was very clear about this. About how these revolutionary leaders get their history completely whitewashed. 100% Obama's mother's boyfriend was involved with the U.S. State Department and third world governments, including but not limited to Indonesia. It's discussed briefly in the Jakarta Method. Yeah, I think that's the Obama conspiracy theory. And as much as the right did the whole thing about him being a secret Muslim and he's like secret communist, like it was literally the opposite. It was quite literally the opposite. What is your take that Assad gassed his people? The U.S. waited forever to bomb Damascus and couldn't wait a couple days for the UN to do an investigation into one of the areas. My main thing about this is that Obama said that there's a red line. Here's my red line for doing regime change in Syria or like really escalating the civil war. And that's if he uses chemical weapons. And then it seemed kind of almost immediately after. It's like, well, he used the chemical weapons. So now I guess we have to. So just not even really looking into the details of the case. I was always just suspicious of that just from the timing of it. That doesn't mean that it didn't happen. None of this is to mean that Assad is a great guy or that he hasn't committed crimes or he hasn't committed war crimes in this civil war. That's kind of like beside the point. But I also wonder too, if this is a civil war that we helped start, which we've established, we armed and funded the people fighting in the civil war, who we know also were extremists themselves. These are not like nice people we were arming and funding in the Syrian civil war. And if we're encouraging this civil war and we're arming and funding the opposition, and then war crimes get committed in this war, don't we bear responsibility for these war crimes? That's kind of my question. We created this war. We encouraged this war. Yeah, the OPCW inspectors went to Syria, were suppressed in the official report, and whistleblowed about it. And again, I don't want to get too much into the details of this, but I've always found it a little suspicious. Yeah, to say nothing of the fact that America carries out chemical weapons attacks on its citizens every day in the form of tear gas. So I'm trying to talk about this conversation without like naming names about people that have been involved in this very public kind of online conversation about this lately. But also I think the idea that like, okay, well, talking about Aaron Mate has been really like getting attacked by a lot of people for his work, for going to Syria and trying to talk about the effects of the regime, the dirty regime change war that we were carrying out. And the people that brought him there, they're under a microscope. People are saying he works for dictators, he works for Assad, he's an Assadist, all this stuff. But one thing he got attacked for, which I don't think should be controversial to point out, was when he talked about that there's plenty of people in Syria that do in fact support Assad, or even if they don't like Assad, they recognize that their choice is between Assad or these like US and Saudi Arabia backed extremists. And if that's what the choice that they're being given, they would prefer to support Assad and just get the US the fuck out of there. It should not be controversial to point this out, that there's many people in Syria that do want Assad to stay, that view Assad, perhaps correctly, as being a kind of like anti-imperialist figure that's preventing the US from doing regime change there and moving in and creating the exact same kind of violence and destabilization that they do everywhere, that they did in Libya. Like we people in Syria can look at what happened in Libya and not want the same thing to happen to their country. And Aaron Monte kind of pointed this out, and it's framed as just like, oh no, you're just that's being a Assadist to say that. To say that there's people in Syria that actually support the government and just want the US out of there. That should not be controversial. It should not be controversial. And people are saying like that's an excuse, and like they frame this issue as being as if like every single person that supports Assad in Syria is just somehow like brainwashed, or they're being forced to by fear. And basically like the idea that there's Syrians that just want the US to get the fuck out of there and just would rather support Assad, even if they don't like him, and even if they too agree that he's committed brutal acts during this civil war, there's Syrian people that still would rather support Assad than support the fucking other side of the civil war, who they know beyond a shadow of a doubt, as we all do, are being funded and armed by the United States and by Saudi Arabia, and these like countries who have a brutal, violent track record in these kind of regime change operations. Yeah, it's not even that he's an anti-imperialist figure, but like, yeah, it's like people in Syria can view that as correctly being their only fucking choice. And it leads, it also, there's like that crossover with North Korea as well. And again, one of the main people that are involved in this kind of online fight right now, I don't want to name names, because this is someone that, for the most part, I have a lot of respect for. And I think is generally a pretty okay person. But this person, in the course of this fight, pretty much used this analogy to talk about the very real phenomenon of the like what should be a non-controversial notion that there's people in Syria that do in fact still support Assad, or just like would rather deal with him than deal with the fucking extremists in the other side of the civil war that we're backing. And the response to this was just like, oh, you think that's, you think everyone in North Korea just has a picture of Kim Jong-un because he's popular? And it's like, yeah, I do believe that. It is not, look at the way that the fucking United States venerates the founding fathers, or Canada. We talk about the founding fathers of these countries. We have statues of them. They're on their money. We talk about how great they are. We talk about how beautiful the Constitution is. Now it's this wonderful document, basically almost like a religious document that we have to follow still from these wonderful founding fathers. Yeah, it does not surprise me that we're not talking about a country that was founded in the 1700s or the 1800s. We're talking about a country that was founded in the 50s, 3 generations ago, by Kim Il-sung, who remains still a national hero in Korea. It is not surprising or shocking, or it should not be controversial at all to point out that there's people in North Korea who do still have affection for the Kim family, or who do still see the Kim family as being like a important figurehead for their country, who look at them and say they've turned us into a nuclear power. They're preventing us. We're now it's impossible to be invaded by the United States. They have this traumatic memory of the end of the Korean War and the fucking genocide and violence that Canada and the United States unleashed on the country. And it's like, yeah, I don't think it should be surprising at all that there's people in Korea that are like, yeah, I'd still do like the Kim family. That's not surprising whatsoever. Nationalism, when you're an imperialist nation, no. US nationalism bad, Vietnamese nationalism good. Yeah. Well, moist outlets, we've talked about before how nationalism can be a powerful force for these colonized countries. It can be a powerful anti-colonial tool, just as much as it can be a powerful colonial tool. And you just have to recognize which is which. But it's weird. Again, these are people that claim to be anti-war, that claim to be against regime change, and they'll use Syria, or they'll use North Korea as this conversation stopper, and just take it for granted the fact that every single person in North Korea that has a picture of the Kim family on their wall is just this brainwashed. It's because they're part of this brainwashed, backwards authoritarian dictatorship. That's colonizer mindset. That's imperialist mindset. The only way they can have pride I can't believe they'd have pride in their country. They'd have pride in the foundation of their country, that they would still think that the Kim family was good, even though we know that they just get starved and you hear what people say about North Korea. It just sounds like comic book villain shit. And they just say it completely, people repeat this completely uncritically. They inject motor oil into people, and they intentionally starve people, and they whatever they say. With zero, you ask any one of these people, how do you know this? How do you know that they do this? And it's just I saw it in a movie. I saw it in Team America World Police. I saw it in a Seth Rogen movie. That's how I know that that's true. Everyone knows. Everyone knows about North Korea and how evil it is. We just know. How do we know, though? Do we know? How dare they have pride in themselves in life? Just because all of us are crushed under the boot of capitalism doesn't mean everyone else is miserable. And none of this is to say that anyone in these foreign governments are good or wonderful people or do all good things. I don't think the Iranian government is based. I don't think Saddam Hussein was based. It's not about that. But it's about recognizing when the imperialists are at their fucking game again, when they're back on their bullshit, recognizing that, and just being against it. Each and every time. And this kind of equivocating, especially on Syria is where we've seen this the most, this kind of equivocating where it's well, I don't support Assad, but I'm against, I'm kind of against everything. This helps no one. This helps nobody. It doesn't help anyone in Syria. It doesn't help anyone in America. All it helps are the fucking imperialists. And the same thing with this China stuff. the same thing with this China stuff. Like, what is realistically, you pull back and look at what your moral position is when it comes to China. Well, I think China's terrible and evil and imperialist, and they're committing all these human rights violations because of this research that I see every week in The Guardian and in the New York Times and the Washington Post and in mainstream media. But of course, I don't support regime change. I don't support like the military. But it's like, what credibility do you have when you're agreeing with the imperialist narrative about this, but saying like, I agree with the narrative, but I support doing nothing, versus the people that are like, this is what the narrative is, and we want to do something about it. We want to do regime change. We want to balkanize China. We want to turn Xinjiang into East Turkestan, and we want to separate Tibet, and we want to separate Hong Kong, and we want to turn China into like 6 different ethno-states. Those are the people that are benefiting from us repeating these narratives about China. It's helping no one. It's helping no one to try and have this nuanced view. This view of like, well, we can walk and chew gum. 2 things can be bad. This helps no one. It only helps the fucking lunatic liars and murderers. The imperialists, the intelligence community guys. That's who it helps to take this stance. Whether it's about China or whether it's about Syria or Libya or Iraq or Iran or any other, or Venezuela or any one of these other countries. This nuanced view. It helps no one. Yeah, I just am saying genocide denial is bad. I'm not saying that the US or any other country should do anything about it. Exactly. This is the stance. This is like an ideological, incoherent stance that many, many people seem to hold. And this is to me is the essence of what being an anti-imperialist is about. Like Che. Like, it's Che's birthday. Listen to Che. You cannot trust imperialism for a minute. Not even a little. Nada. And there's a lot of people specifically in the Twitch streaming and YouTube streaming community that are like, oh yeah, I'm against imperialism. Oh yeah, I'm against the military. Oh yeah, I'm against regime change. Except time and time again, they seem to basically agree with the stances of these imperialists and these regime changers. They just don't really agree with the tactics. And it's like, you're just helping them. Do not trust these people. These are the bad guys. This is the thing. And this is the framework that always helps me. They're liars and murderers. You cannot trust them. Ever. Ever. This is what people need to get into their heads, I think. Not enough people are doing this. This is why I like Michael Parenti, because he was clear about this. And again, it's critical support. It doesn't mean that like we just accept that these places are great or they're completely beyond criticism or beyond reproach. But ultimately, that's what critical support is. You know? And just when we repeat these narratives about countries like China, like Syria, we're only helping the bad guys who want just the worst for everyone. The beasts, as Che called them. I used to think the Vice documentary on North Korea was so bold. Looking back on it, it's mostly filled with old US propaganda films and Shane talking about how he thought the food was awful. And again, Vice, another media company that does good work on some things, that does some good work on domestic extremism, and takes CIA money and has that foreign policy line. What was the Vice Libya thing? Remember that? you can count on me. You're gonna have good old Rob to talk you through all this. There's one story in Vice that's like, we rode around with some anti-Gaddafi Vice. I was kidnapped by Gaddafi loyalist forces in Libya. They were fully on board with the regime change operation in Libya. Vice. Fully on board. And any outlet that takes money from the CIA or any CIA cutout cannot be trusted on these issues. And yeah, now they're doing stories on the Libyan civil war. And it's like, well, how did this happen? How could this civil war have happened? They literally inside Libya's failed revolution. I'm trying to find the really damning one that took place in 2014. This is still 2017. But around the time of the regime change things, they celebrated it. Because they helped manufacture consent for it. And honestly, it should not be difficult, given what happened in Libya, it should not be difficult for people to just unequivocally be against regime change in Syria, regardless of what anyone calls you, because of that. We know what the plan is for Syria, just as the exact same as it was for Libya. And it's going to be a fucking disaster. Can anyone find the piece that I'm talking about? Oh, thanks Red Scary for gifting a sub to Moist Owlettes. Thanks Red Scary. I appreciate that. It's 2016. This is the basic point that I've been trying to make, though, is that when it comes to Syria, it does not make anyone an Assadist for just being, number one, being unequivocally against doing regime change in Syria, or by suggesting that there's people in Syria that would prefer to have Assad than prefer to have the US-backed extremists that are fighting in the civil war. It should not be controversial to point that out. And it doesn't make you an Assadist to point this out. At all. But for some reason, this has become a very big phenomenon on the left, where anyone that pushes back against this narrative gets framed in this way. Still in 2015. I will find this eventually. I will find this piece that I'm talking about eventually. I'm pretty sure Adam Johnson has talked about it before from Citations Needed. But this is the trick, right? Like they're covering a lot of the humanitarian crisis that unfolds in Libya. They're covering the migrant crisis in Libya, but they literally supported the regime change operation there. They support the regime change operation there, and then they cover the humanitarian disaster that unfolds after. With this complete fucking cognitive dissonance. Here's Justin Ling. The Canadian government has a difficult case to make for legally bombing Syria. Thanks, Justin. Justin Ling, if you'll recall, that called the Bolivia, or refused to call the Bolivia coup a coup. It's the same fucking thing all the time with these guys. I'm still in 2015. It's interesting going back in time about this, actually, because it's like we're seeing the results. We're seeing the results of the regime change. And then we're getting to the point where the regime change happens. I don't know if I can find the piece that I'm looking at. I'm looking for. Actually, as soon as I said that, I believe this is it. Sorry, it took me so long to find that. Celebrating Gaddafi's death with a Libyan on a Segway. And again, but like they take money from the intelligence community. Just got off the phone with my mom, so I know this is late, but I think you're being too nice to the US on the Syria stuff. Well, honestly, Ben, what I'm trying to do is walk a line between saying we should be unequivocally against the US doing regime change there without like being like I don't think Assad is based. I don't want to suggest that. You know, I don't think that. But we have to be, I think you're right, though, that we have to be clear about who started this civil war, who were on the other side of this civil war, who armed them, who financed them, who trained them. That's us. We did that. And it should not be controversial to say like this war that we started has been a fucking disaster. And there's many people in Syria that do, in fact, still support Assad and just want the U.S. to get out of there. Like Aaron Mate said that I think that's a pretty mild take. Everyone's talking about who paid for his trip to Syria and who's involved in the pro-Syrian democracy movement and these groups that funded him. It's like, but avoiding the basic reality of the argument that he was making, which is that we started this war. It's been a fucking disaster. And there's people in Syria that just like would rather go with Assad than to support the extremists that the United States are backing to win this war. A lot of the chemical weapons facilities were literally just pharmaceutical plants, and the reason they got bombed was because they didn't care about Western patent laws. It's certainly a rabbit hole. It's certainly a rabbit hole. I've been trying to talk about this subject with my typical like nuance. But you're right that I probably am being too mild on it. But I think the ultimate point that I'm making is that like that's what anti-imperialism should be all about. You see what the imperialists are doing. In this case, trying to do regime change in Syria. It's not a secret. They were very clear about their designs on Syria and wanting to overthrow the government. You can count on me. You're going to have good old Rob to talk you through all this. Hey, Comrade Social Distancing. Thanks for gifting another sub. Very kind of you, Comrade Social Distancing. Thank you very much. Yeah. Well, it is something we can explore more. I don't know if I want to get too far into this now. Here's the last connection I wanted to make about this, though, right? Is that, and we know this, that one part of the extremist groups that have been operating in Syria as part of the civil war have been coming from Xinjiang. Extremists and separatists that came from Xinjiang to fight in the Syrian civil war. And a lot of what we're seeing now in that area is China's response to that extremism.
This is some guy, Rob Russo, some leftist based in Canada. I was turned on to this sick individual, and I found
Professor
this.
Melko. Thanks very much for the raid. Look at that. Get in here, Raiders. We're just talking about just some totally normal stuff. Nothing controversial. Nothing weird. Just completely normal. Just kind of hanging out. Nothing subversive. Don't even worry about it. I don't know what these emotes are. I've never seen these before. Canada's a little third world country. I can't even get in for my second vaccine. I actually made my appointments on the 31st. So actually, our rollout was pretty bad, but it's actually gotten a lot better. Yeah, there's no federal agents here. I'm definitely not. We established this early on. I am not a federal agent. I don't have any affiliation with the CIA or any of these intelligence community people. So, just in case anyone was unclear about that, that is not accurate. Not CIA. Not true. I take back my raid then. Thank you very much for, is it Professor Melko? Please everyone make sure to give Prof Melko a follow. How do I do this? Is it like this?
We simply use the computer to mark up the size of the account.
Not me, Rob, not me.
Thank you, Anus Beard. Treasured community member Anus Beard. Thank you for the shout out. Thank you, Chester. That was a boomer moment for me. I still don't totally know how Twitch works, even though I am a verified Twitch partner now. I'm a verified official Twitch partner. Doesn't have affiliation with any Intel community people. Ben's like, we don't mind the turncoats and the double agents, Ben. We have use for those. But I was just pointing out this connection. We're talking a little bit a non-controversial subject of Syria and the Syrian civil war and the fact that, I'm talking about anti-imperialism. And if you are anti-imperialist, you should have noticed a while ago that the imperialists, the intelligence community types, which I'm against and I have nothing to do with, very much wanted to do regime change in Syria. And it shouldn't, when you say that you're against that, when you say that you're against regime change there, when you say that no, I don't support the Syrian civil war, I don't think there's any nuance to this, I don't want to try to have a nuanced position about this, we should just get the fuck out and let Syrians deal with their own internal matters, whether they want to continue on with Assad or what. We should just be we should not be doing that. And this has become a very controversial stance to have on the left. and you get called a dictator supporter or a genocide denier, a sadist, whatever. And it's just, this to me is utter bullshit. And what I was pointing out is that there's a very real connection between the Syrian civil war. No, I'm not a big fan of the proxy wars. That's right. This stream is like a CIA workshop for when we go infiltrate random Maoist groups in urban city centers. We test out our personas here. That's right. We get all the talking points down here. And then it just allows us to just get right in there. But what I was pointing out, though, is that there's a very real connection between the extremists and separatists in Xinjiang who went to fight in the Syrian civil war, who then started operating out of Xinjiang, provoking a response from China, which has now been used to justify cracking down on China and sanctioning China and trying to balkanize China and trying to do regime change there. And that is, you got to be able to point out that connection. And this is what got us started on this, looking at, because it's Che's birthday. It's Che Guevara's birthday. And I think this is the principle that we need to have. We need to understand who these imperialists are. We need to understand what their goals are. And we have to understand that these people are liars and murderers. And when we see them up to their antics, their imperialist antics, when they're trying to do regime change in Iraq or Iran or Venezuela or Syria or Libya or China, when we see them doing this, we have to say, no. No, thank you. I am against this. What we don't need to say is, I'm against that, but I don't want to support a dictator. I don't want to support this. And we have to point out all the ways that these countries are bad. And we agree, actually, that all this bad stuff is going on. But that is nothing. We can't do this. We have to stop this. We have to stop this. We have to stop trying to have nuance about these things when we understand who these people are. We know what they're doing. We know what their plans are. And it only helps them to have this kind of hand-wringing position about these regime change operations, whether it's in Syria or Venezuela or anywhere else. You think Xi is a hawk? The previous guy was a technocrat. I think that's kind of a weird way to describe Xi, considering they're not doing wars with anyone. I don't think China's bombed anyone. They haven't tried to take over any new territory. I think he probably correctly realizes that his country is under threat from the global superpower that wants to ensure that they don't get surpassed in terms of global capitalist powers. But that's actually correct. It's actually correct to point that out. But Taiwan. But what are they doing in Taiwan? Have they actually done anything? I've heard a lot about what their plans are and how they're planning to do all these evil things. What are they actually doing? And how do we know what their plans are in Taiwan? Because we read about it in The Guardian. We read about it in The Washington Post. We read about it in the New York Times. These mainstream media outlets have been their partners in the imperialist program, I just don't believe them. I don't trust them. I don't like them. Oh boy. You know what? I'm not going to get into this big argument. We're getting to the end of the stream. I have to go in a couple minutes. let's just say to some of the new chatters, I don't totally agree. I don't totally agree with some of these claims that are being made. I don't really believe a lot of the stories that I hear about what China's plans are and what they're doing, because it's being made by people with a very clear ideological agenda. It doesn't mean that I think that they're 100% perfect or that everything's fine, or that every single human right is like violated, is respected. You know, I'm not saying that, but I also don't really trust the narrative that we're hearing about China. They've done a really good job of actually taking people out of poverty. They have. It's actually pretty amazing the work that they've done trying to eliminate extreme poverty. We don't hear much about that in the news media, though. We only hear about the aggressive things, about how they want to do all these terrible things. They want to annex Taiwan. They're doing genocide. They're doing cultural genocide. You know what? There may be kernels of truth mixed up in some of that stuff, but I don't trust the people that are creating these narratives. I don't. If any of the people that are spreading these narratives have ties to the national security establishment or the intelligence community, I don't trust them. We don't trust imperialist media. This is, again, Che. It's his birthday. Che Guevara. You have to understand who the imperialists are. And when you understand who they are and what their plan, what their game is, then you just have to, you don't trust them for a minute. Not even a little. Nada. That's my general stance on this. China has helped a lot in Africa. It's also not controversial to say Xi is a hawk. It's okay to have an activist and expansionist agenda. China's just pursuing its interests. Well, I guess what I would push back on Angry Bear 88888 is just that when I think of hawkishness, I think of like military hawkishness. I think of that in the context of the United States, like doing regime change. Oh man, doing regime change like at gunpoint. And doing assassination attempts and coup d'etats and all this shit that the intelligence community has been doing for decades and decades. That's what I would view as hawkishness. I don't really view hawkishness as like building roads and ports and hospitals in Africa in a kind of like transactional way to get access to then to developing natural resource projects. I guess you could frame that as being expansionist somehow, or expanding their sphere of influence. But hawkishness, I associate deliberately with violence, though. Which isn't, to me, it's not the same thing. Yeah, like when they exceed 800 plus military bases around the world, I'll call them hawkish. That to me is more of like a military expansionism. And you can definitely point to them like being aggressive in expanding their sphere of influence, but I'm not sure I would call it hawkishness, because that to me is, there's an inherent violence to that. Can't get behind the post-dang market socialism at all. Well, Marxiavelli, that's what we're going to try and change your mind on this. If you come back to the stream, I've been kind of brought on board this. I mean, listen, if you view, this is my very simple explanation of this, not to go down the rabbit hole of Deng Xiaoping economic reforms. This is my basic stance on this, though. If you view America as being a threat, global capitalism, or imperialism headed by America, you should probably support them being supplanted as the number one global superpower in the world and the number one economy. And because of these Dengist reforms, China is indeed on the verge of becoming the world's number one global economy. It's probably going to happen in the next 10, 15 years. So you can criticize, or you can split hairs about like whether this was a good idea, whether you want to call it market socialism, whether you want to call it state capitalism. You can call it whatever you want. You can call it anything you want. That's what sorry. But that's what Parenti talked about often, right? Yeah, thank you, Biggerwig. That's what he talked about. Call it whatever you want. Call it window shades. That's what you want to call the economic system. But you still can't really argue with the results. The ultimate results are that China is on the verge of beating the US as the number one global economy. They're eradicating extreme poverty. They're developing these places in Africa and actually building like infrastructure projects and actually helping people in this process. To me, this is something that we should probably support. Even if it's not the ideal version of socialism that you have in your mind, it's not living up to this. You know, you can suggest that it's not the perfect stateless, classless society that we all would like to have. But I think you can't really argue with the results, because the reality that we're living in right now. That's what I try to deal with. I don't try to deal with the idealized utopian idea that we have in our minds about what the world should look like. We have to deal with like the reality that we're living in. And the reality is that as long as the United States exists, there will never be a country that achieves that level of socialism that we're talking about, that utopian socialism. It's not going to happen. You need to have a country that's going to provide a counterbalance to the United States. And that is what's happening.
You can count on me. You're going to have good old
and we should
Rob
support
to
that.
Talk you through all this.
I don't know enough about China, and obviously the poverty alleviation is great. However, the thing I fear about China is that I don't see how the proletariat hold the levers of power. Well, yeah, there's still a class system in China, but I think if you look at it and compare it to our system of government, and look at the way things work, the way the media works, the way the government works, the way they're able to like just complete these huge infrastructure problems that help predominantly the people like in rural areas and the poor people. The proletariat may not hold the levers of power, but they're benefiting much more from this system than similarly situated people here in the West. And the reality is this utopian idea of utopian socialism that we would all like, the stateless, classless society that Marx speculated on. We're hundreds of years away from achieving this. And one of the ways this needs to get achieved is that the United States needs to be supplanted as the number one global superpower that controls controls the economic system for the entire world at gunpoint. That's one thing that has to happen one step that has to happen along the way. I think that's a nuanced view, King Uendo. A wait-and-see position with China. I just don't know if capital has corrupted their power structures. We can't know until they supplant the U.S. as the global financial powerhouse, and we do know that the U.S. are terrible. Yeah. None of this is to mean that everything I think is great, or that it's a perfect government, it's a perfect country. Or should the U.S. change from within? But I don't think that's possible. I don't think it's possible to meaningfully change the US. You might be able to enact some kind of like social democratic policies. Even that, I don't know if it's possible. Look at the way that the US ruling class and the media reacted to Bernie Sanders' campaign, who's just a social democrat who just wants people to have healthcare and education. Look at how they reacted to that. Like it's the fucking, they were talking about it like they were Nazis marching down the street. They're going to be like executed in Central Park and shit like that. I don't even know if it's possible to change America from within. And even look at Biden's agenda. Biden's big, bold agenda that he promised everyone, it's not happening. Guess what? It's not happening. And they're on the verge to handing back power to the like far right wing. It turns out that maybe voting on where to build this high-speed rail kind of just leads to NIMBY politics. Maybe having professional nerds do stuff is okay sometimes because everyone is more happy anyway. Yeah, like we talked about these like ghost cities. That was the big story 10 years ago. China's building all these ghost cities. No one lives there. And now you have Western economists looking at these cities just filling up with people and being like, how did this happen? It's like, well, it's almost like they've got a planned economy, and they're just capable of arbitrarily taking these steps. That actually seems pretty good to me. Where should I look for info on China? I mean, I like, if you understand that it's Chinese propaganda, the CGTN, or what is it? Is it CGT? Yeah, CGTN. They do good stuff on like the poverty reduction programs and all the stuff that's going on in China. You understand that it's funded by the government, but you can't trust any Western media narratives about it because they're imperialists. Full stop. So anything you see about China in The Guardian, The Washington Post, The New York Times, Vice, Bellingcat, wherever, even if it's like on this independent media spectrum, you have to just be like, this is probably just all bullshit and lies.